Yo, what's up everybody? Shadowlands is quickly approaching, but before that happens, I wanted to take some time to discuss the BFA dungeons. I spent a ton of time grinding Mythic Plus and BFA, and just thought it would be good to sit down and discuss what these dungeons got right, what they got wrong, and then put them in some sort of ranking order. So, let's take a look. Okay, so the first dungeon we're going to talk about is DAGOR. This is absolutely hands down the worst dungeon in BFA. There's just no contest here. There were some cool features in this dungeon. You know, the concept of breaking into an offshore Alcatraz style prison is pretty cool. You know, I also really like some of the unique things they tried in here by, opening cells of prisoners from your faction that give you a buff. That's kind of a neat idea. However, where this dungeon really failed was just in the delivery. The height and spacing of this dungeon just created so many massive issues. You know, multiple bugs were found. Groups were pulling mobs through floors, through walls. It just was a giant mess. So that paired with some really annoying trash and boss mechanics, you know, this dungeon is definitely the worst of the group. So the next dungeon on our list is Siege of BORALUS. This was a fairly average dungeon. You know, this was one of the two pirate-themed dungeons in BFA, but this particular dungeon really lacked pretty much anything special. You know, the pathing of this dungeon was really unilateral. There weren't really any route options. You had to follow the same path every time. You know, there wasn't much choice or decision-making involved from your group, and you know, outside of the final boss, there wasn't really any unique mechanics or boss fights to kind of help this dungeon stand out. So, although this wasn't really a bad dungeon, it was pretty forgettable and average in almost every way. So, that's kind of why this dungeon landed so low on my list, and why Siege of BORALUS really isn't anything special. Temple of SETHRALIS comes next, and this dungeon actually had some pretty interesting features. You know, they added an electrical field maze with these little sparks that you had to navigate through, you know, as well as the snake eyes puzzle that kind of allowed you to access the entranceway to the last boss. You know, in terms of the dungeon's theme and some of the uniqueness, you know, it has a lot of character. In terms of mechanics, that's kind of where it suffered. You know, I think the first two boss fights were pretty good. They had some interesting dynamics to them. They were different. They were unique. However, the last two bosses, particularly the final boss, the Avatar of SETHRALIS, was mind-numbingly boring. I mean, just these waves and waves of ads. You heal him up. I mean, this dungeon was so close to being good, and then they threw that fight in there, and it just completely fell short. So Temple of SETHRALIS comes in at number 10 on my list as being almost, but just not quite there. MECHAGON Workshop is the next dungeon we're going to discuss, and it was the second half of an originally 8-boss dungeon that was added in 8.2. You know, I really like the art style of this dungeon, and personally love the idea of having at least one larger kind of Black Rock Depths style dungeon thrown into the mix. You know, I really like diversity, and although I understand the reasoning of breaking this mega dungeon up into 2 sections for higher difficulties, I really think there could be an argument made for Blizzard to mix things up from time to time and give us a little variety in how many bosses and how long the dungeons are, maybe as well as some of the rewards they offer. You know, that being said, Workshop is fun. You know, it had some cool boss mechanics and unique features. However, with the addition of the Awakened affix, there was still really only one route you could ever take in this dungeon. So there's not a lot of decision making here for the player. And although there's a lot of charm in this dungeon, it doesn't really rank as well as its counterpart Junkyard, simply because it's really the same thing every single time that you do it. Shrine of the Storm comes in at number 8, and was debatably probably one of the hardest dungeons in BFA. You know, it had some really hard-hitting trash and difficult boss fights. I think that this was especially true in Mythic Plus, especially when paired with certain affixes. I really enjoyed the challenge and thought this particular dungeon had some really great boss fight mechanics, but it was extremely hard to pug, and there were kind of a few niche decisions you could make when running this dungeon, but not a lot. The biggest thing is that this dungeon lacked a checkpoint. The map was super long, and since some of the other dungeons had checkpoints, I was kind of confused why they didn't add one here. So that made this dungeon especially hard to time consistently. All in all, I think Shrine of the Storm was a solid dungeon, but where it seemed to fall apart was its synergy with certain affixes and how it really fit into the Mythic Plus system. So Shrine of the Storm comes in at number 8, just behind these other ones, but still, all in all, a pretty good dungeon. Next on our list is King's Rest. Now, King's Rest developed a little bit of a reputation in BFA, and some of this criticism is definitely justified. With the addition of the Awakened affix and just kind of the linear path of how this dungeon works, it suffered a lot of the same problems that Shrine of the Storm suffered. They did give us one actual skip or checkpoint, if you want to call it that, in this dungeon. However, with the Awakened affix, we skip a lot of trash at the end of the dungeon, which leads you to the final boss. So if you do use the checkpoint skip, there is potential there for you to run into some of that trash that your group didn't kill, and it just created some problems. So you could kind of tell that some of the thought processes here, and its synergy with Mythic Plus wasn't thought out extremely well. But outside of those issues, this was a really fun dungeon. The Golden Serpent, Machimba the Embalmer, the Council of Tribes, and DAGOR the First King were all really fun boss fights. They had some unique mechanics. Some of them suffered a little bit with tyrannical weeks, specifically the Council of Tribes, and the order you got could create problems. So it's definitely not the best dungeon by any means, but I think with a few small changes, this definitely could have been a really great dungeon. Coming in at number 6 on the list is the UNDEROT. Now, this is probably one of the most recognizable dungeons from BFA, and it is for good reason. It's a beautiful dungeon. However, there are a couple things, before you step inside here that you need to know, and that's that the trash in this dungeon was very punishing, especially at higher levels. There were a lot of CCs you had to hit, some interrupts that you needed to kick. But by itself, this dungeon was just a lot of fun. In terms of boss fights, Elder Leexa was kind of meh, but, that's to be expected. She was the first boss fight in the dungeon. However, Kragmaw the Infested, Sporecaller Xancha, and the Unbound Abomination all had some really great mechanics. They were pretty unique, and you really had to think through how you needed to defeat these bosses. Really where this dungeon struggled, like some of the other dungeons that we've talked about, is its integration with the Mythic Plus affixes and the Mythic Plus system, specifically Tyrannical Weeks. This dungeon on Tyrannical was exceptionally hard due to Kragmaw the Infested's phasing. The way that he phased based on percentage of health when you added in Tyrannical made it almost a nightmare. You needed Bloodlust, you needed your cooldowns in order to actually down this boss, otherwise you would wipe. So for whatever reason, Blizzard never actually patched this or fixed it, and it just was always an issue in BFA. For that reason, it's not higher up on the list, but this is a really fun dungeon. It had a lot of really cool features to it. So coming in at number 6 is UNDEROT. Okay, so we've breached the top 5 in terms of dungeons for BFA, and WAYCREST Manor is a dungeon that really starts to hit all the checkboxes that I'm looking for when it comes to excellent dungeons. I really enjoyed that they did a couple different things here. They added some different routes in the beginning of this dungeon, so each week whenever you enter it, there is one of 3 doors that will open, which means you have to go a certain direction. This really kind of gives it some variation and makes it a little bit more fun to, replay, in my opinion. The trash in this dungeon is difficult enough that you can't just go on autopilot, but I also think that each boss fight in here felt unique enough without being overcomplicated. The downsides of this dungeon were really pretty minimal. The only other thing that I could think about was maybe sometimes, during a Sanguine affix week or even during explosives, this dungeon could get a little bit frustrating because the hallways were kind of narrow. I also think for new players, it was very easy to get lost. But other than that, I love this dungeon. The theme, the artwork, kind of the epic feel of heading down into the basement, you know, to defeat this demon lord was pretty cool. You know, it quickly became one of my favorites, which is why it's in my top 5. So, people might call me crazy for listing Motherload so high in this list, but I personally just love this dungeon. You know, the goblin theme aspect of it, like many others in this list, it just nails the art style, and it brings with it some really fun encounters. Now, the beginning trash in Motherload is really fun for me. I play a lot of, you know, bursty rogue, demon hunter classes that like to just pop, you know, AoE abilities and see big numbers go flying. And so the beginning of this dungeon's really fun for classes like that because it has an open layout. You can kind of pull as much trash as you want. And if you're able to juggle all the interrupts and all the CCs, you know, there's some really cool ads. You've got mechanized peacekeepers, you've got idle thugs, you've got refreshment vendors, you've got hired assassins. So if your group is good enough, you can really pull as much as you can handle and try and cut a little bit of time. I also really like that they added a checkpoint after the first boss. You pair that with, you know, the Awakened affix, and you can kind of do some creative things to help you really eliminate some time off your Mythic Plus run. Now, in terms of boss encounters, I really like, you know, the haste buff that they added with the coin-operated crowd pummeler. You know, you kick the soccer balls into them, it gives you a buff. You know, as well as some of the trash kiting and the DPS check that comes with the Azarok encounter. You know, the Rixa Flux Flame fight could maybe be considered a weak point here. It's just an okay encounter. But, you know, all the other fights and the trash balance in this dungeon is just excellent in my opinion. You know, I love some of the unique elements they added, like when you ride in the cart down the railroad track. That's a lot of fun, and I just never get tired of running this dungeon. It's just always fun for me. So that's why it's appearing in my top 5. Coming in at number 4 is Motherload. If you've made it this far, we have breached the top 3, and coming in that number 3 spot is Freehold. Now, Freehold has always been one of the most favorited dungeons in BFA, and that's for good reason. The trash in here is pretty challenging. There are a few pulls where you really need to be careful with your positioning because you can kind of pull other groups by proximity. And the boss fights are really pretty whimsically themed. You know, they have a lot of great mechanics as well as just some cool additional things they added to this dungeon. You get to catch a greased up pig. You get a drink from a barrel of juice, I guess. I don't know, Blizzard question? Juice, rum, something. You get to help a guy escape from a cage by having his dog get some keys off of some guards. There's just a lot of fun, interesting things that you can do in this dungeon. And the boss fights are really great as well. Sky Captain Crag has a parrot that flies down and swoops in there, has some unique mechanics. Ring of Booty's fun and just entertaining. And then the Harlan Sweet fight is difficult and challenging enough, but not so hard that you can't pair it with an Awakening Obelisk boss. So, you know, there's just a lot that you can do in this dungeon to save time. As well as the great open layout, it just allows you to make a lot of unique decisions, allows your team or your group to kind of do some unique creative things. So that's why this dungeon deserves all the praise that it's getting and why it hits my top 3. Coming in at number 2 is ATAL'DAZAR. Now, we're finally getting into the best of the best when it comes to BFA dungeons. A lot of people may be questioning why this one ended up so high on my list, but I'm going to tell you why. This dungeon and its layout just synergized so well with the Awakened affix that the route options literally became endless. There were so many creative things you could do. Every single time I stepped foot inside this dungeon, I learned something new, I found ways to improve. It just was a lot of fun. Now, not only that, but a large group of Mythic Plus players spent some extended time in here finding other ways that you could cut down on your time by using things like snapping, which is, I'm going to call it an exploit, where you kind of put yourself in a position and ads can snap to you. And that was a really cool way to AoE down certain ads that could kind of be a little troublesome at times. Not only that, but on top of all of this, the fights were all fun. The mechanics were unique, and like I said, the routes were endless. It was just a great dungeon, and you could easily argue this to be the best dungeon from BFA, and in my opinion, that's why it's landing in the top 2 spot. Okay, so coming in at number 1, the final and best dungeon from BFA is Junkyard. This dungeon really had everything you could ever want in a dungeon. Like its counterpart Workshop, the art style was beautiful. They just completely nailed it. They basically took the map from MECHAGON Island and just created this wide open dungeon layout. They incorporated a lot of kind of unique and cool elements in this dungeon as well, the first being the flying war machine. Now, the concept here was that there was a war machine that flew over each zone. So when you entered the dungeon, you would have to see where its location was and avoid it unless you wanted to add some extra difficulty. So the concept here really kept routes and pathing unique every week or every single time you entered into this dungeon. And so this paired with the awakened obelisks really kept it kind of interesting, and it gave your group the freedom to make some really good strategic decisions. On top of that, they also added 3 types of buffs that each player could collect from different scrap bots found around the yard. These buffs were a really cool Easter egg and rewarded skillful players because they did not persist through death. So you had to stay alive in order to keep that benefit throughout the whole dungeon. This unique element really allowed some skilled groups to push the limits of high keys, because we saw this dungeon being pushed to higher levels out of pretty much any other dungeon in BFA. The boss fights in here were creative and fun, and the trash packs felt very balanced and interesting. There really wasn't much to critique in here. You know, it's just a great wide open design, and I think that it absolutely should serve as a model for future dungeons. So in my opinion, Junkyard was by far the best dungeon in BFA, offering a fun and yet competitive dungeon experience. Well, that concludes my video on the BFA dungeons. Overall, I think that this expansion had probably some of the best dungeons that we've ever experienced in WoW's history. But I'd love to hear from you guys on this. What did you guys think of my rankings? Let me know in the comment section down below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys, and until next time, peace.